The rain in Chicago that night wasn't just weather. It was an omen. My name is Ava, and 3 hours before I found myself in the most expensive bed in the Midwest, I was standing on a sidewalk in the middle of a torrential downpour with nothing but a cracked suitcase and $30 in my bank account. My life had disintegrated in a single afternoon. I had walked in on my boyfriend of 3 years, the man I had sacrificed my career for, with another woman. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just packed what I could fit into one bag and walked out into the storm. My car, an old sedan that was barely holding together, gave up the ghost 3 miles from the city center. I was soaked to the bone, shivering so violently my teeth were chattering, when I saw the golden glow of the Grand Meridian. It stood like a fortress of glass and light against the bruised Chicago sky. I had a voucher, a one-night stay I had won at a silent auction months ago. I'd been saving it for an anniversary that was never going to happen. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and silent wealth. I felt like a smudge on a masterpiece as I dripped water onto the pristine floors. The receptionist looked at me with a cold, professional pity. "Room 903, Miss Lee," she said, sliding a gold-embossed keycard across the marble. "The elevators are to your left. Enjoy your stay." I was a zombie. I was so exhausted that the air felt thick like I was moving through water. When I stepped onto the 9th floor, the hallway was a tunnel of silence, smelling of expensive cedar and silence. My vision was blurred by tears and exhaustion. I reached the end of the hall and saw the numbers. 904. In my mind I saw 903. My hand, shaking from the cold, tapped the card against the sensor. Beep. The lock didn't just click, it sighed open. I didn't think about why the door opened so easily. I didn't think about the fact that the suite was vast, a dark cavern of luxury that smelled of aged bourbon and a crisp, masculine cologne. I didn't even turn on the lights. I was afraid that if I saw how beautiful the room was, I'd realize I didn't belong there. I kicked off my wet boots. I shed my damp clothes in the dark, leaving a trail of my broken life on the floor. I saw the silhouette of the bed, a massive king-sized mountain of white silk. I crawled into it, the sheets feeling like cool water against my skin. And then I felt it. A source of heat. It was like a furnace in the center of the bed. In my delirium I thought it was a luxury heated mattress. I moved closer to it, desperate for the warmth. I felt a solid, muscular form beneath the duvet. My brain, clouded by a feverish exhaustion, told me it was just a dream. I let my hand rest on what I thought was a pillow, but it felt like warm living stone. I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, unaware that 6 inches away from me, one of the most powerful and ruthless men in the world was beginning to stir. I didn't know that the hotel's biometric system had glitched during a power surge from the storm. I didn't know that the man next to me was Silas Vane, a man who lived in total isolation because he didn't trust a soul on earth. I slept peacefully, tucked into the arms of a lion, while the storm raged on outside. I had no idea that when the sun rose, I wouldn't just be waking up in a different room, I'd be waking up in a different world. A world where the door was locked from the outside, and the man beside me was already deciding exactly what he was going to do with the girl who had dared to invade his sanctuary. The first thing I registered wasn't a sound but a feeling. It was the weight of the air. It felt heavy, charged with an energy that didn't belong in a vacant hotel room. My consciousness returned slowly, like ink spreading through water. I felt the softness of the Egyptian cotton beneath my cheek, and for a split second, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. I was warm. I was safe. But as my mind cleared the fog of exhaustion, a terrifying realization settled in my gut. The heated mattress I had huddled against all night was breathing. I froze. Every muscle in my body turned to ice. My heart, which had been beating in a slow, deep slumber, suddenly kicked against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't open my eyes. I couldn't. I just listened. Thump, thump, thump. It was the steady, powerful heartbeat of a man. I could feel the rise and fall of a broad chest against my shoulder. I could smell him. The scent was no longer a faint memory of bourbon. It was the sharp, clean smell of expensive soap and a raw, masculine heat. I slowly, agonizingly, cracked one eye open. The room was flooded with the gray, clinical light of a Chicago dawn. My gaze traveled down the white duvet. There, resting just inches from my face, was a hand. It was a large, powerful hand with long fingers and a heavy platinum watch that caught the morning light. I followed the arm up. Tanned skin, corded muscle, and then a face. My breath hitched. I knew that face. I had seen it on the cover of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. This was Silas Vane, the man they called the Vulture of Wall Street. A man famous for his brilliance and infamous for his absolute lack of mercy. He was beautiful in a way that felt dangerous, like a jagged cliffside. Even in sleep, his brow was slightly furrowed, as if he were calculating a hostile takeover in his dreams. And I was in his bed. I tried to slide away millimeter by millimeter. I held my breath, moving my leg with the caution of someone stepping through a minefield. But the moment I moved, the atmosphere in the room changed. The breathing next to me didn't speed up. It stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I stayed perfectly still, my eyes locked on his. Then, in one fluid, terrifying motion, Silas Vane didn't just wake up, he attacked. Before I could scream, a heavy weight pinned me to the mattress. His hand, cold and strong, clamped over my mouth. His other arm was braced beside my head, his body hovering over mine like a predator over its prey. His eyes were open now. They weren't the soft, hazy eyes of a man waking up. They were charcoal gray, sharp as flint, and burning with a lethal intelligence. "Do not make a sound," he whispered. His voice wasn't just deep. It was a vibration that felt like it was coming from the earth itself. I looked up at him, my eyes wide with terror. He wasn't looking at me with desire. He was looking at me like a problem to be solved. His gaze scanned my face, my hair, the way my pulse was visible in my neck. "Who sent you?" he hissed, his grip on my jaw tightening just enough to let me know he could break it if he wanted to. "Was it the board? Was it Thorne? How much are they paying you to be in my bed when the press arrives?" I shook my head frantically against his palm, tears of pure fear pricking my eyes. Silas narrowed his eyes. He slowly moved his hand from my mouth, but he didn't move his body. He stayed pinned against me, his chest pressing into mine. "Please," I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. I made a mistake. Room 903. My key. It opened the door." Silas let out a cold, dry laugh that sent a shiver down my spine. "Room 903 doesn't exist on this floor, sweetheart. This is my private wing. This door doesn't open for anyone whose DNA isn't in the system." "But it did." I sobbed, the reality of the situation finally breaking me. I was tired. I was wet. I just wanted to sleep. I didn't know who you were. I didn't even know anyone else was in the room. Silas stared at me for a long, agonizing minute. He was looking for a lie. He was looking for the tell that would prove I was a spy or a tabloid plant. But all he found was a girl in a cheap t-shirt with messy hair and eyes full of genuine raw terror. He slowly pulled back, sitting up on the edge of the bed. He didn't look at me as he reached for a silk robe on the chair. He looked at the nightstand where my gold-embossed keycard lay. He picked it up, his thumb running over the smudged ink where the fur looked like a 3. "The storm," he muttered to himself. "A power surge must have tripped the biometric bypass during the reset." He turned back to me, his expression unreadable. He looked at my suitcase by the door, my wet boots, and the puddle on his expensive rug. "You're not a spy," he said, his voice dropping the lethal edge but keeping the coldness. "You're just an idiot." "I'm sorry," I said, scrambling to the other side of the bed, clutching the duvet to my chest. "I'll go. I'll leave right now. Just, please don't call the police." Silas stood up. He was tall, over 6 feet of lean, intimidating power. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the Chicago skyline, his back to me. "You aren't going anywhere, Ava," he said. My heart stopped. "What? Why?" He turned around and for the first time a small, dark smile touched his lips. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had just seen a way to turn a disaster into an opportunity. "Because in 10 minutes my security team is going to walk through that door with 3 members of the board who are trying to prove I'm unstable, because I live like a hermit. If they find a trespasser, I look like a failure. But if they find a guest..." He walked toward me, leaning down until his face was inches from mine. "You entered the wrong room by mistake, Ava. But you're going to stay here by choice. Because if you don't play the part of my secret lover for the next 48 hours, I will make sure the trespassing charge is the least of your worries. Do we have a deal?" 48 hours, I whispered, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. "You want me to pretend to be in love with a man who just threatened to throw me in prison?" Silas didn't even blink. He was standing by a mahogany sideboard, pouring 2 cups of black coffee. The steam rose in the morning light, obscuring his features for a moment. He looked like a statue carved from shadow. "I don't need you to be in love with me, Ava," he said, handing me a cup. His fingers brushed mine, and despite the fear, a jolt of electricity shot up my arm. "I need you to be a distraction. The men who are coming through that door in exactly 4 minutes are looking for blood. They think I'm cold. They think I'm a machine that's finally starting to rust. They want to replace me with someone human. If you are here looking like you belong, their entire argument vanishes. And if I refuse?" Silas leaned in, his shadow falling over me. "Then I call the police. I tell them you bypassed my security to steal trade secrets. I have the best lawyers in the world, Ava. You'd be buried under paperwork before you even saw a judge. Is that what you want for your new start?" I looked at the coffee. I looked at my wet boots by the door. I had no money, no home, and now the most powerful man in Chicago was holding the leash. "What do I have to do?" "First," Silas said, his eyes scanning me with a clinical, terrifying intensity, "you need to look like someone I would actually choose." He walked over to a panel on the wall and pressed a button. A section of the suite's wall slid back silently, revealing a walk-in closet that was larger than my entire apartment. It was filled with designer gowns, silk robes, and shoes that sparkled like jewels. "These were for a previous arrangement," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave. For a split second I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a ghost of a memory. But then the ice returned. "Pick something black. Minimal. You're supposed to be a woman of mystery, not a showgirl." I spent the next 3 minutes scrubbing the remnants of the storm from my face and stepping into a silk dress that felt like liquid midnight. When I stepped out, Silas was waiting. He had changed into a suit that looked like it cost more than my college tuition. "Your hair," he muttered. He stepped toward me, his large hands reaching out. I flinched, but he didn't stop. He ran his fingers through my damp waves, pulling them over one shoulder. His touch was firm but strangely careful. "Look at me," he commanded. I lifted my gaze to his charcoal eyes. Up close I could see the fine lines of exhaustion around them. Silas Vane wasn't just a billionaire. He was a man who hadn't slept in a very long time. "Your name is Ava," he said, his voice a low, hypnotic rumble. "We met 6 months ago in Paris. You're a painter. You hate the press. That's why no one has seen you. You're the only person who sees the real me. Do you understand?" "I don't even know the real you," I countered. "Exactly," he whispered, his face inches from mine. "That's why you'll be so convincing. The real me doesn't exist." Suddenly the doorbell chimed, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the suite like a funeral bell. "Smile, Ava," Silas hissed, his arms sliding around my waist. His grip was like a branding iron, pulling me flush against his side. "And whatever you do, don't let them see your hands shaking." The door opened and 3 men in gray suits walked in. They were older, with faces like stone and eyes that moved like predators. They were the board of directors. They expected to find Silas alone, brooding in the dark. Instead, they found him standing by the window, a beautiful woman tucked under his arm, his thumb lazily stroking her hip in a gesture that looked devastatingly intimate. "Gentlemen," Silas said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "I believe you're early. I don't believe you've met Ava." I felt their eyes on me, sharp, suspicious, searching for a crack in the armor. I did the only thing I could. I leaned my head against Silas's shoulder and let out a soft, practiced laugh. "I told you they were punctual, Silas," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. For the next hour I lived a lie. I watched Silas navigate the conversation like a grandmaster playing chess. He was brilliant, cold, and utterly convincing. But as the meeting dragged on, I noticed something. Every time one of the men mentioned his father or the legacy of the company, Silas's grip on my waist would tighten just a fraction. It wasn't a gesture of affection. It was a silent plea for stability. When the men finally left, the silence that returned to the suite was different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy with the weight of the performance. Silas let go of me instantly. He walked to the bar and poured a glass of neat bourbon, his back to me. "You did well," he said. The coldness was back, but there was a tremor in his hand as he lifted the glass. "Who was she?" I asked softly. "The woman those clothes belonged to?" Silas froze. He didn't turn around. "That's not part of the deal, Ava. You said I'm the only one who sees the real you." I stepped closer, the silk of the dress rustling. "But I think the real you is hiding behind a lot of expensive furniture and a dead woman's clothes." Silas turned, his eyes flashing with a sudden, violent heat. He set the glass down with a crack that echoed in the room. He moved across the space in 3 strides, pinning me against the wall. He didn't touch me, but his presence was a cage. "You have 36 hours left," he growled. "Don't mistake a business arrangement for an invitation to my life. You're a guest, Ava. And guests eventually have to leave." He walked out of the room, slamming the heavy oak door behind him. I stood in the dark, wearing a dress that wasn't mine in a life that wasn't mine, realizing that the Ice King wasn't just cold. He was frozen in a past that he wouldn't let anyone melt. The 48-hour clock was ticking down, but the air in the limousine felt like it was running out of oxygen. Silas sat across from me, his face illuminated by the passing streetlights of downtown Chicago. He looked perfect, a masterpiece of tailoring and cold indifference. I, on the other hand, felt like a fraud wrapped in a 5-figure Valentino gown. "Tonight is the final move," Silas said, his voice level despite the chaos of paparazzi we were about to face. "The Miller charity auction. Every eye in the city will be on us. If we survive the next 4 hours, the board will retreat and you will have your boutique back." "And if someone recognizes me?" I asked, my fingers twisting the silk of my skirt. "I'm not a painter from Paris, Silas. I'm a girl who failed at her own business." Silas leaned forward, his hand catching mine to stop my fidgeting. His skin was warm, a sharp contrast to his icy gaze. "In this world, Ava, people only see what you show them. Tonight you are my equal. Act like it." The car slowed to a halt. The red carpet of the Drake Hotel was a sea of flashing lights. As the door opened, the noise hit me like a physical wave. "Silas." "Who is she?" "Mr. Vane over here." Silas stepped out first, then reached back for my hand. He didn't just lead me, he claimed me. His arm went around my waist, pulling me so close that I could feel the steady beat of his heart through his tuxedo jacket. For a man who hated being touched, he was a terrifyingly good actor. Inside, the ballroom was a cathedral of gold and crystal. But as we moved through the crowd, the whispers followed us like a trail of smoke. "Silas, darling, you've been hiding gems from us," a woman in a shimmering silver dress cooed, her eyes scanning me like she was looking for a flaw in a diamond. "This is Ava," Silas said, his voice dropping into that low, possessive growl we had practiced. She prefers the quiet. I've simply been respecting her wishes. I played my part. I smiled. I nodded. I leaned into him when the questions got too pointed. But then across the room near the velvet-covered auction stage, I saw a face that made my heart stop. It was Mark. My ex-boyfriend. The man I had walked out on only 2 days ago. He was standing there with a champagne glass, looking smug in a rented tux, talking to a group of minor investors. He hadn't seen me yet, but he was moving closer. "Silas," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We have to leave. Now." "We can't leave, Ava. The auction hasn't even started." "He's here," I hissed, leaning into his ear as if I were sharing a secret. "Mark. My ex. The man I told you about. If he sees me, he'll tell everyone I'm a nobody. He'll ruin everything." Silas didn't flinch. He didn't even look toward the crowd. He simply tightened his grip on my waist. "Then we don't give him the chance. Stay close to me." But it was too late. Mark turned, his eyes landing on the woman in the midnight blue gown. At first he looked confused. Then, as he recognized me, his face contorted into a mask of disbelief and then opportunistic greed. He began walking toward us, pushing through the socialites. "Ava." Mark's voice was loud, cutting through the polite hum of the room. "Ava Lee? Is that actually you?" The circle of people around us went silent. The sharks sensed blood in the water. Silas turned slowly, his eyes narrowing into 2 slivers of gray ice. "I'm sorry," Silas said, his voice dripping with a condescension that could freeze the sun. "Do we know you? Do you know me?" Mark laughed, looking at the crowd. "I lived with her for 3 years. Ava, what is this? Some kind of costume? Since when do you hang out with Silas Vane?" I felt the eyes of the board members, who were watching from the balcony, drill into me. The lie was crumbling. I felt the urge to run, to vanish into the night. But Silas didn't let go. He stepped in front of me, his massive frame shielding me from Mark's gaze. He looked down at Mark as if he were an insect that had crawled onto an expensive rug. "I don't know who you are," Silas said, his voice low and lethal. "But you are distressing my fiancé. I suggest you find the exit before my security team finds you." "Fiancé." The word hit the room like a grenade. Even Mark fell back stunned. "Fiancé." Mark stammered. "She's a broke boutique owner who—" "She is the woman who is going to be the head of Vane Holdings," Silas interrupted, his voice echoing in the silent ballroom. "And you are a man who is about to be blacklisted from every bank in this city if you speak her name again." Silas beckoned to 2 large men in black suits at the edge of the room. Within seconds, Mark was being escorted toward the service entrance, his protests muffled by the heavy doors. Silas turned back to me. The crowd began to murmur again, the scandal turning into the wedding story of the decade. But Silas wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at me. His eyes were no longer cold. For the first time I saw a flicker of something else. Something raw, something protective, and something that looked a lot like genuine fear. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his hand lingering on my cheek. "You called me your fiancé," I breathed, my heart racing. "That wasn't in the script, Silas." "I did what was necessary to protect the asset," he said, the ice beginning to refreeze over his expression. But he didn't pull his hand away. The auctioneer's gavel struck the podium, calling for attention. But as the bidding began, I realized that the real price had just been set. Silas Vane hadn't just saved my reputation. He had tied my life to his in a way that 48 hours could no longer fix. The ride back to the Grand Meridian was silent, but it was a silence that screamed. The interior of the limousine felt smaller than it had 4 hours ago. Outside, the Chicago rain had returned, blurring the city lights into streaks of neon. Silas sat in the corner, his silhouette sharp against the window. He hadn't let go of my hand since we left the ballroom, but his grip was no longer a performance. It was tight, almost desperate. "Fiancé Silas?" I finally whispered, the word hanging in the air like a ghost. The board was there. The press was there. Mark was there. You didn't just tell a lie, you started a war. Silas didn't look at me. His jaw was set so hard I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. Mark was a variable I hadn't accounted for. He was a threat to the narrative. I neutralized him. You neutralized him by binding yourself to me. I pulled my hand away, the coldness of the evening finally catching up to me. What happens on Monday, Silas? What happens when the world wants to see a ring? What happens when your fiancée disappears back into her life of failed boutiques and empty bank accounts? Silas turned his head slowly. His charcoal eyes were dark, reflecting the passing streetlights. Do you think I haven't considered that? I don't make moves I haven't calculated 10 steps ahead, Ava. We reached the hotel. The staff bowed lower than before. The news had already traveled. We were no longer a billionaire and a guest. We were the city's most powerful couple. The elevator ride to the 9th floor felt like an eternity. When the doors opened to the royal suite, Silas walked in and immediately went to the bar. He didn't take off his jacket. He didn't look at me. He poured a double scotch and drank it in one go. You're shaking, he said, his back still turned to me. I looked down at my hands. He was right. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a hollow, terrifying exhaustion. I'm not used to being a pawn in a billionaire's chess game, Silas. I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the dark lake. I felt the weight of the Valentino gown, the weight of the black diamonds at my throat. It all felt like a costume that was starting to choke me. I reached behind my neck, struggling with the clasp of the necklace, but my fingers were too clumsy, too cold. Let me, a voice rumbled behind me. I froze. Silas was standing directly behind me. I hadn't even heard him move. His presence was like a physical heat, radiating through the thin silk of my dress. He reached out, his large hands replacing mine at the nape of my neck. His touch was agonizingly slow. I could feel the calluses on his fingertips as they brushed against my skin. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of our breathing. The necklace came free. But Silas didn't move away. He held the diamonds in one hand, while his other hand lingered on my shoulder. He turned me around slowly, forcing me to face him. You asked about the woman before you, he whispered. His voice was no longer cold. It was raw, stripped of the billionaire mask. The woman those clothes belonged to. I couldn't speak. I just watched his eyes. Her name was Elena, he said, his gaze drifting to a point somewhere behind me. She was the only person who didn't want my money. She wanted me. We were supposed to be married 5 years ago. But I was too busy building this empire. I was too busy winning. I was late to the airport the day her flight went down. I spent 5 years freezing everyone out because I thought if I stayed cold I could stay safe. He looked back at me, his eyes searching mine with a desperation that made my breath catch. And then you walked into the wrong room, he murmured. A girl with no plan, no money, and the most annoying habit of looking at me like I'm a human being instead of a bank account. You're not a pawn, Ava. You're the first thing that's made me feel warm in half a decade. He stepped closer, pinning me between his body and the window. He didn't touch me with his hands, but his forehead rested against mine. I didn't call you my fiancé just to save the board meeting, he hissed. I called you my fiancé because the thought of you walking out that door in 24 hours makes me feel like I'm losing everything all over again. He leaned down, his lips inches from mine. This wasn't a script. This wasn't a performance for the board. This was a man who had been frozen for 5 years finally starting to melt. Stay, he whispered. Don't just stay for the 48 hours. Stay because you want to. I reached up, my hands finding the lapels of his tuxedo. I should have said no. I should have run. But as he pulled me into a kiss that tasted of scotch and 5 years of loneliness, I realized that I wasn't just in the wrong room. I was exactly where I was meant to be. The sun rose over Lake Michigan not with a glare, but with a soft, golden warmth that filled the royal suite. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up to the sound of an alarm or the weight of anxiety. I woke up to the steady, calm breathing of the man beside me. Silas was still asleep, his face relaxed, the Ice King mask completely gone. I realized then that the wrong room hadn't just changed my life, it had saved his. But the world outside didn't care about our peace. By 8 a.m. the hotel's phone lines were jammed. Every major news outlet in the country was running the headline, "The Vulture Captured. Silas Vane engaged 2 mystery heiresses." I sat at the edge of the bed watching the news ticker. "Heiress," I whispered. They still didn't know I was just a girl with a suitcase. "Let them wonder," Silas's voice rumbled from behind me. He sat up, his hair messy, his eyes clear. "The more they wonder, the less they know. And the less they know, the safer we are." "But Silas, the 48 hours are over," I said, turning to him. "The board meeting is in 1 hour. What happens when you walk in there without your fiancé?" Silas stood up, walking toward the window. He looked out at the empire he had built, then back at me. "I'm not walking in there without you, Ava. But I'm not asking you to play a part anymore. I've already had my lawyers draft the papers. Your boutique isn't just being saved. Vane Holdings is investing $5 million into a new line of luxury galleries. You won't just be the owner, you'll be the CEO." I stared at him, stunned. "You're giving me a career?" "I'm giving you the platform you deserve," he said, stepping closer and taking my hands. "But only if you stay. Not as a guest. Not as a lie. As my partner." The board meeting was held in the hotel's grand conference room. The air was thick with tension. The 3 directors sat at the head of the table, their faces sour. They were ready to call our bluff. They expected me to have vanished in the night. When the doors opened, Silas walked in, but he didn't lead. We walked side by side. I was wearing a sharp white power suit, a gift from the previous arrangement closet that I had finally made my own. "Mr. Vane," the lead director said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "We've seen the papers. We've seen the gossip. But the board requires proof of stability before we vote on your chairmanship." Silas didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned back in his chair and looked at me. "The proof isn't in a headline," I said, my voice projecting with a confidence I didn't know I possessed. "The proof is in the numbers. Under my direction, Vane Holdings is launching its first creative equity branch. We are diversifying. We are moving away from vulture tactics and into sustainable growth." I laid the folders on the table, the plans Silas and I had whispered about in the early hours of the morning. The directors looked at the papers, then at each other. They saw a man who wasn't just cold and calculating anymore. They saw a man who had found his missing piece. The vote was unanimous. Silas stayed. After the meeting, we stood on the balcony of the suite, the same place I had looked out from Inter just 2 days ago. "You did it," Silas said, leaning against the railing. He looked at the ring on my finger. Not a fake one this time, but a band of platinum he had pulled from his safe that morning. "You saved the king." "The king was already there, Silas," I said, leaning into his side. "He just needed someone to remind him that even a palace is just a house if the doors are always locked." I looked down at my gold keycard, the one with the smudged 3, that looked like a 4. I didn't throw it away. I tucked it into my pocket. A reminder that sometimes, the biggest mistake of your life is actually the only thing that goes right. I entered the wrong room by mistake, but as Silas pulled me into a kiss that promised a lifetime of mornings just like this one, I realized I had finally found my way home. And so the Ice King found his fire, and the girl who lost everything found a kingdom. It just goes to show that you should never be afraid of a closed door, because sometimes, the wrong key leads you exactly where you were always meant to be. If you enjoyed this 60-minute journey into the heart of Silas and Ava, please subscribe to Gemini Stories. We create these deep cinematic romances every week just for you. Hit that like button if you believe in second chances and lucky mistakes. And I want to know, comment wrong room, if you've ever had a mistake turn into a blessing. Don't forget to click the video on your screen now for more billionaire mysteries and slow burn romances. Until next time, watch your step and keep your heart open. Good night and stay romantic, everyone.